The most dangerous mistake is believing you already know who someone is before they have spoken a single word. The morning sun cast long golden reflections across the marble buildings of Washington, District of Columbia, where history seemed to echo through every column and every carefully preserved street. Government employees hurried toward nearby offices carrying briefcases and coffee cups, while visitors admired the architecture surrounding one of the nation's most recognizable federal districts. It appeared to be another ordinary weekday, the kind that passed unnoticed by almost everyone walking those sidewalks. A distinguished black woman stepped through the front entrance of a constitutional law symposium after delivering a keynote address attended by judges, professors, and legal scholars from across the country. She wore a navy blue tailored suit, carried a leather portfolio beneath one arm, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce her accomplishments. Her expression reflected calm rather than authority, and she paused briefly to thank the event coordinator before walking toward the curb where a vehicle was expected to arrive within minutes. Few people recognized her face, and that anonymity suited her perfectly. She believed the law should speak louder than the people entrusted to uphold it. Across the street, Officer Daniel Harper continued his morning patrol, scanning the busy sidewalks with practiced attention. He had worked the downtown district for several years and considered himself experienced at identifying situations that deserved closer attention. As he observed pedestrians moving between federal buildings, his attention settled on the woman standing quietly beside the curb. She checked her watch once before looking toward approaching traffic, remaining composed despite the growing activity surrounding her. Daniel slowed his pace and continued watching from several yards away. Something about the situation convinced him that he should ask a few questions, although nothing around the woman suggested urgency or danger. Nearby tourists stopped to photograph historic landmarks, while office workers crossed the intersection beneath changing traffic lights. Everything about the morning remained peaceful. The woman noticed the approaching officer long before he reached her, yet she showed no sign of concern. Instead, she greeted him with a polite smile that reflected years of treating every encounter with courtesy regardless of circumstance. Daniel returned the greeting before asking if she would mind answering a few routine questions. His tone remained professional, but his confidence suggested he had already formed conclusions before hearing a single answer. The woman responded with steady composure. "Certainly, officer. How may I help you?" Her calm voice carried neither hesitation nor irritation. Daniel asked where she had been that morning, whether she worked nearby, and whether she could provide identification. Without changing her expression, she answered each question respectfully while asking only enough to understand the reason for the conversation. A few pedestrians began slowing their pace, sensing the growing seriousness of what had started as an ordinary exchange. From farther down the block, two individuals dressed in business attire quietly observed the interaction without approaching. They appeared to be ordinary professionals waiting outside a nearby building, yet their attention never drifted away from the conversation. The woman glanced briefly toward them before returning her focus to Daniel. She then asked one quiet question that carried unexpected weight despite its gentle delivery. "Officer, before we continue, may I ask whether you are certain you wish to proceed exactly as you are now?" Daniel interpreted the question as simple curiosity and answered with complete confidence. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I believe it is important that I do." The woman offered a respectful nod, saying nothing further as the morning breeze moved softly through the trees lining the avenue, while the two observers remained exactly where they were, patiently waiting without interrupting, as though they understood that the next few moments would change everything. Officer Daniel Harper maintained a courteous expression, yet his questions became increasingly deliberate as the quiet intersection continued filling with pedestrians beginning another workday. The woman answered every inquiry with remarkable patience, never raising her voice or showing the slightest sign of frustration. She presented herself with the calm confidence of someone who understood that composure often revealed more strength than argument ever could. Daniel noticed the leather portfolio she carried and asked whether she had attended an event inside the federal building. She replied with a gentle smile that she had just concluded a legal symposium discussing constitutional principles and public trust. Her answer was precise without being defensive, and she volunteered nothing beyond what had been asked. Daniel studied her for another moment before requesting identification once again. "It will only take a minute," he explained. "I simply need to verify a few things." The woman nodded respectfully. "I understand your responsibility, officer. I also hope every step we take today follows both the law and good judgment." Her words sounded less like a challenge and more like a reminder that every official encounter carried lasting consequences. Around them, the city continued moving as buses arrived at nearby stops and office workers crossed the avenue beneath changing traffic lights. A small group of visitors slowed near the sidewalk, sensing an unusual conversation unfolding outside one of the nation's most important government districts. None of them interrupted. They simply watched with quiet curiosity. Daniel asked whether she lived in Washington or was visiting from another state. She answered honestly that her work often required travel and public appearances. He then asked where her vehicle was. She glanced briefly toward the curb. It should arrive shortly. Daniel looked up and down the street, but did not see anyone approaching her. Unknown to him, the same two professionally dressed individuals remained several yards away, calmly observing every exchange while speaking softly into discreet communication devices almost invisible beneath their collars. They did not move closer. They did not interfere. Their attention remained entirely focused on the conversation. The woman noticed them once again, but continued addressing Daniel with complete respect. "May I ask what specifically caused your concern this morning?" she said. Daniel paused before answering. "Something about the situation seemed unusual, and I believed it was appropriate to make contact." She accepted the explanation with a thoughtful nod. "Making contact is sometimes appropriate," she replied. "The reasons behind that decision matter just as much." Her calm response caused Daniel to hesitate for the first time. There was no fear in her voice, no resentment in her expression, and no attempt to embarrass him in front of the growing number of bystanders. Instead, she treated the conversation as though it were an opportunity for both of them to demonstrate professionalism. A black sport utility vehicle turned onto the avenue and slowed near the curb without drawing unnecessary attention. It stopped several yards away, remaining perfectly still. No one exited immediately. The vehicle simply waited. Daniel briefly glanced toward it before returning his attention to the woman. "Would you remain here for another moment, please?" he asked. She answered with the same steady composure she had shown since the beginning. "I have remained here willingly because I respect the responsibilities of your position." The morning breeze lifted the pages of a newspaper resting on a nearby bench as the two observers exchanged a nearly imperceptible glance. Without urgency and without creating alarm, they straightened their jackets and quietly prepared to step forward, while the woman remained exactly where she was, her calm expression unchanged, as though she had known from the very beginning that the truth never needed to rush in order to arrive. The quiet tension surrounding the intersection became impossible to ignore as more pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing that an ordinary conversation had quietly evolved into something far more significant. Officer Daniel Harper remained convinced that extending the encounter was the responsible decision, yet he could not explain why the woman standing before him appeared so remarkably composed. She neither argued nor attempted to leave. Instead, she stood with quiet dignity, her leather portfolio resting comfortably beneath her arm, her attention focused entirely on the officer speaking to her. "I appreciate your patience," Daniel said, trying to maintain a professional tone. "I simply need to make certain everything is in order." The woman offered a courteous nod. "I appreciate professionalism as well, officer. It protects both the public and those entrusted to serve it." Her answer lingered in Daniel's thoughts longer than he expected. There was something unusually measured about every sentence she spoke, as though years of experience had taught her that calm words often carried greater influence than emotional ones. The black sport utility vehicle remained parked quietly along the curb, its engine idling almost silently beneath the shade of mature oak trees lining the avenue. A moment later, the rear passenger door opened with deliberate calm. Two individuals dressed in dark business suits stepped onto the sidewalk. Neither wore a visible uniform, yet their posture immediately reflected disciplined training. They exchanged only a brief glance before walking toward the conversation at an unhurried pace, careful not to create unnecessary attention. Daniel noticed them approaching and instinctively shifted his position slightly, acknowledging their presence without taking his attention away from the woman. "Do you know those gentlemen?" he asked. She answered honestly. "Yes, I do." "Are they meeting you?" Daniel continued. "They are ensuring that my schedule continues safely," she replied, her tone remaining completely even. The answer sounded unusual, yet not confrontational. The two suited individuals stopped several feet away, careful to respect the ongoing conversation. One of them spoke first with remarkable courtesy. "Good morning, officer. My name is Michael Bennett." He displayed a professional identification wallet only briefly before returning it to his jacket. "We are here in an official protective capacity." Daniel acknowledged the identification without immediately understanding its significance. "I appreciate that," he replied. "I am completing a routine inquiry." Michael nodded respectfully. "We understand, and we appreciate your professionalism. We would simply like to ensure that today's schedule proceeds without unnecessary delay." The second agent remained silent, calmly observing both the officer and the growing number of curious onlookers who had gathered across the sidewalk. The woman continued saying nothing, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. She never attempted to interrupt or influence either side. Daniel looked from the two suited individuals back toward the woman. "May I ask exactly who you are protecting?" he said. Before either man answered, the woman smiled gently. "Officer, everyone deserves to be treated with fairness before their title is known." Those words caused a noticeable silence to settle over the sidewalk. Even several nearby pedestrians seemed to pause, sensing that an important moment had arrived. Michael Bennett glanced respectfully toward the woman, receiving the smallest nod of approval. Only then did he remove a second credential from an inside pocket and hold it where Daniel could examine it clearly. His voice remained calm, professional, and entirely free of confrontation. "Officer Harper," he said, "we are assigned to the protective detail of Associate Justice Evelyn Brooks of the Supreme Court of the United States." For a brief moment, the sounds of passing traffic, distant conversations, and footsteps seemed to fade into the background as Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward the woman standing before him, realizing that the person he had viewed as an ordinary pedestrian had quietly carried one of the highest constitutional responsibilities in the nation all along. Officer Daniel Harper remained completely still as the significance of Michael Bennett's words settled over the quiet intersection. The morning bustle continued around them, yet for Daniel the city suddenly felt distant, replaced by the realization that the woman standing calmly before him was not simply another passerby. Justice Evelyn Brooks met his gaze with the same composed expression she had maintained from the beginning of their conversation. There was no satisfaction in her eyes, no desire to embarrass him in front of the gathering crowd, only the quiet dignity that had defined every word she had spoken that morning. Michael Bennett respectfully lowered his credentials after Daniel had finished examining them. "Our responsibility is to ensure the justice's safety while allowing her to carry out her public duties without unnecessary interruption," he explained in an even tone. "We appreciate the responsibilities carried by local law enforcement, and we always aim to cooperate whenever possible." Daniel slowly nodded, absorbing each sentence. His confidence had not disappeared because of the woman's title alone. It had changed because he suddenly recognized how many assumptions he had made before carefully evaluating the circumstances. He looked back toward Justice Brooks and spoke with genuine sincerity. "Ma'am, I was not aware of your identity." Justice Brooks answered softly. "Officer, my identity should never determine whether I am treated with fairness. Every person deserves the same professionalism, whether their name is widely recognized or completely unknown." Her response lingered in the silence that followed. Several nearby pedestrians who had quietly watched the exchange lowered their phones, no longer interested in capturing a dramatic confrontation. Instead, they witnessed something far more meaningful: two public servants confronting an uncomfortable moment with restraint and respect. Michael Bennett glanced briefly toward the second member of the protective detail, who remained alert but relaxed, never stepping unnecessarily into the conversation. Their presence alone communicated readiness without intimidation. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. "If my actions caused unnecessary concern, I regret that." Justice Brooks acknowledged his words with a gentle nod. Recognizing an opportunity to learn is one of the strongest qualities any public servant can possess. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent decades interpreting the Constitution not only as a legal document, but as a promise that fairness belonged to everyone equally. The morning breeze stirred the American flag flying above the nearby federal building as the black sport utility vehicle waited quietly at the curb. Michael checked the time discreetly before informing the justice that her next appointment would begin shortly. She thanked him before turning once more toward Officer Harper. "The responsibilities you carry are important," she said. "So are the responsibilities carried by every citizen you meet. Those responsibilities work best when they strengthen one another instead of creating unnecessary distance." Daniel listened carefully, understanding that the lesson unfolding before him extended far beyond one conversation on a Washington sidewalk. He respectfully stepped aside, signaling that the encounter had concluded. Justice Brooks offered a final courteous smile before walking toward the waiting vehicle. Her protective team accompanied her at a comfortable distance, remaining attentive without drawing attention to themselves. As she reached the rear passenger door, she paused briefly and looked back across the avenue. Daniel was still standing where they had spoken, thoughtful rather than defensive, watching the vehicle prepare to depart. Neither of them realized that the events of that ordinary morning had already been quietly documented through routine reports, witness observations, and security recordings, setting the stage for a conversation about professionalism, judgment, and public trust that would soon reach far beyond a single intersection in the nation's capital. Justice Evelyn Brooks arrived at the Supreme Court later that morning with the same quiet composure she had demonstrated throughout the encounter. The conversation on the sidewalk had already become another entry in a long career filled with moments requiring patience instead of emotion. She thanked Michael Bennett and the protective team for their professionalism before continuing to her scheduled meetings, never asking anyone to draw attention to what had happened. Inside the courthouse, discussions quickly shifted toward constitutional questions awaiting review, reminding everyone present that the work of justice continued regardless of the distractions surrounding it. Across the city, Officer Daniel Harper completed the routine documentation required after every public interaction. He carefully described the sequence of events exactly as they had occurred, omitting nothing and adding nothing beyond what he had personally observed. His supervising lieutenant later reviewed the report together with publicly available security recordings from nearby federal buildings, not because anyone had accused Daniel of misconduct, but because every interaction involving protected officials required careful documentation. The recordings confirmed that the encounter had remained calm and professional from beginning to end. They also revealed something Daniel had not fully recognized while standing on the sidewalk. Justice Brooks had answered every question respectfully, never attempted to leave after agreeing to speak, and repeatedly encouraged a conversation guided by fairness rather than confrontation. Later that afternoon, Daniel was invited to meet privately with his lieutenant. The atmosphere inside the office remained calm and constructive. The lieutenant closed the report folder before speaking. "No one doubts your commitment to public safety," he said. "The question we should always ask ourselves is whether our first assumptions are supported by objective facts." Daniel listened carefully without attempting to defend every decision. Instead, he reflected on the sequence of events exactly as they had unfolded. He remembered the justice's quiet question asking whether he was certain he wished to continue in the same manner. At the time, he had interpreted it as confidence. Now he understood it had also been an invitation to reconsider his approach before the situation became unnecessarily prolonged. Meanwhile, Justice Brooks concluded her meetings and accepted an invitation to speak with a group of law students visiting the court. During the discussion, one student asked how public servants should respond when facing misunderstandings in everyday life. Without mentioning the morning's encounter or identifying anyone involved, Justice Brooks answered thoughtfully. "Every position of responsibility carries two obligations," she said. "The first is to fulfill the duties of the office. The second is to remember the humanity of every person affected by those duties." Her words resonated throughout the room because they reflected experience rather than theory. Back at the police district, Daniel requested additional training materials on constitutional policing, procedural fairness, and communication during voluntary public contacts. His lieutenant noticed the request with quiet approval. Growth, he believed, always began when someone chose learning over pride. As evening settled across Washington, District of Columbia, the events of the morning had already begun shaping conversations inside two very different institutions devoted to public service. One protected the Constitution through judicial decisions. The other protected neighborhoods through daily law enforcement. Although their responsibilities differed, both depended upon the same foundation. Trust could never be demanded simply because authority existed. It had to be earned, strengthened, and renewed through thoughtful decisions made one respectful conversation at a time. Several weeks passed, and the conversation that had begun on a quiet Washington sidewalk continued producing thoughtful changes far beyond the people directly involved. At the Metropolitan Police Department, Officer Daniel Harper completed additional training sessions focused on constitutional policing, communication during voluntary encounters, and recognizing the importance of evaluating objective facts before allowing first impressions to influence professional judgment. The courses were neither disciplinary nor symbolic. They were practical opportunities to strengthen the skills expected of every officer entrusted with serving a diverse community. Daniel approached each session with genuine determination, taking careful notes and participating in discussions with instructors, fellow officers, and legal experts invited to share different perspectives. Rather than viewing the experience as a setback, he gradually began seeing it as an opportunity to become the kind of officer he had originally hoped to be when he first entered public service. Across the city, Justice Evelyn Brooks continued fulfilling her responsibilities without mentioning the encounter publicly. She believed that public confidence in institutions grew stronger when difficult moments became opportunities for improvement instead of occasions for unnecessary spectacle. During another constitutional law forum, she spoke about the relationship between authority and humility without referring to any specific individual. The law, she told the audience, is strongest when every person applying it remembers that dignity belongs equally to every citizen standing before them. Those words quietly circulated among students, attorneys, judges, and public servants attending the event, inspiring conversations that extended well beyond the lecture hall. Meanwhile, Michael Bennett and the protective detail continued carrying out their assignments with the same disciplined professionalism that had defined their work for years. During an internal briefing, Michael reminded newer members of the team that effective protection often depended upon calm communication rather than unnecessary intervention. Our responsibility, he explained, is to create stability, not attention. His colleagues nodded in agreement because the encounter outside the symposium had demonstrated exactly how patience could prevent unnecessary escalation. One afternoon, Daniel received permission to attend a community outreach program hosted jointly by local law enforcement and legal educators. To his surprise, Justice Brooks had accepted an invitation to participate as one of the featured speakers. As attendees gathered inside the community center, Daniel wondered whether she would remember him. She did. After the program concluded, she approached him with the same composed smile she had offered on the sidewalk weeks earlier. "Good afternoon, Officer Harper," she said warmly. Daniel greeted her respectfully. "Good afternoon, Justice Brooks. I appreciate the opportunity to hear you speak again." She thanked him before asking how his training had progressed. Daniel answered honestly that it had challenged him to examine decisions more carefully and to ask himself better questions before reaching conclusions. Justice Brooks smiled with quiet approval. "Growth," she replied, "is one of the finest outcomes any difficult experience can produce." Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, yet it reflected something entirely different from the uncertainty of their first meeting. There was no tension, no misunderstanding, and no audience waiting to witness a dramatic exchange. There were simply two public servants speaking openly about responsibility, professionalism, and the shared goal of strengthening public trust. As they shook hands before leaving the community center, both understood that meaningful change rarely arrived through dramatic moments alone. More often, it appeared through small decisions repeated consistently over time, each one quietly reinforcing the principles that allowed justice and public service to stand together rather than apart. Autumn gradually settled over Washington, District of Columbia, painting the city's tree-lined avenues with shades of amber and crimson while daily life continued with its familiar rhythm. The encounter that had once seemed destined to become an uncomfortable memory had quietly transformed into something far more meaningful. Within the Metropolitan Police Department, Officer Daniel Harper had earned the respect of several senior instructors for the seriousness with which he embraced every opportunity to improve. During scenario-based training sessions, he no longer rushed to conclusions or relied upon instinct alone. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions, observed carefully, and encouraged younger officers to slow down long enough to understand the full context before making important decisions. His lieutenant noticed the difference immediately. "Confidence is valuable," he told Daniel after one exercise, "but disciplined judgment is what earns lasting trust." Daniel carried those words with him long after the training ended. Across the city, Justice Evelyn Brooks continued serving on the nation's highest court with the same quiet dedication that had defined her entire career. Public appearances, legal conferences, and constitutional discussions filled her calendar, yet she never allowed recognition or status to change the humility with which she approached every conversation. At another gathering of judges and law students, she spoke about public institutions and the invisible thread connecting every profession devoted to serving others. "Respect is never divided," she explained. "When one institution strengthens public trust, every institution benefits." Her audience listened attentively, recognizing that her words reflected decades of experience rather than simple philosophy. Meanwhile, Michael Bennett and the protective detail maintained their disciplined routine without drawing unnecessary attention. Their assignment remained exactly as it had always been: to safeguard the justice while preserving the normal rhythm of her public life. One afternoon, after another educational forum concluded, Michael noticed Officer Harper standing across the plaza assisting several tourists who had become confused while searching for a nearby memorial. Daniel patiently provided directions, answered additional questions, and wished them a pleasant visit before returning to his patrol. Michael observed the interaction quietly before mentioning it later to Justice Brooks as they walked toward their waiting vehicle. "He seems different," Michael remarked. Justice Brooks smiled gently. "Sometimes one meaningful conversation becomes the beginning of many better decisions." Several weeks later, a joint community forum brought together judges, police officers, educators, and neighborhood leaders to discuss ways of strengthening public confidence in civic institutions. Daniel attended as a participant rather than a speaker, taking careful notes throughout the presentations. During a question-and-answer session, one audience member asked how professionals should respond after making an honest mistake. Justice Brooks paused briefly before answering. "The measure of character is not whether mistakes occur," she said calmly. "It is whether wisdom grows afterward." Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment, recognizing that the lesson described exactly the journey he had experienced since that quiet morning outside the symposium. As the event concluded, participants from every background gathered for informal conversations, exchanging ideas rather than arguments. Judges spoke with patrol officers, students spoke with attorneys, and community leaders spoke with educators. Watching those conversations unfold, Justice Brooks reflected that lasting justice was rarely built through dramatic courtroom moments alone. More often, it was strengthened by ordinary people choosing patience over assumption, listening before judging, and remembering that every respectful conversation had the power to shape the next one. Daniel quietly left the building that evening with renewed purpose, understanding that the badge he wore represented not only authority, but also the daily responsibility to earn the confidence of every person he was privileged to serve. Winter arrived in the nation's capital with clear skies, crisp air, and a renewed sense of purpose that seemed to touch every institution devoted to public service. Months had passed since the quiet encounter outside the Constitutional Law Symposium, and the lessons drawn from that ordinary morning continued shaping decisions in ways few people would ever recognize. Officer Daniel Harper had become one of the department's most respected advocates for procedural fairness, often volunteering to mentor newly assigned officers during their field training. Rather than teaching them only policies and procedures, he encouraged them to pause before making assumptions, to observe carefully before drawing conclusions, and to remember that every person they encountered carried a story that could never be understood through appearances alone. His advice came not from textbooks alone, but from experience that had permanently changed the way he viewed his profession. During one afternoon patrol, Daniel observed another officer preparing to question a visitor standing outside a federal building. Before the conversation continued unnecessarily, Daniel quietly approached and suggested introducing themselves first, explaining the reason for the contact clearly and listening carefully before making additional decisions. The interaction remained respectful from beginning to end, and the visitor thanked both officers for their professionalism before continuing on the way. As they walked back toward their patrol vehicle, the younger officer smiled and admitted, "Taking an extra minute made the entire conversation easier." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Respect often saves more time than assumptions ever will. Across town, Justice Evelyn Brooks concluded another session of oral arguments before returning to her chambers. Her responsibilities remained as demanding as ever, yet she continued finding opportunities to encourage future generations of lawyers, judges, and public servants. During a meeting with judicial clerks, she reflected on the importance of humility within every branch of government. "Titles describe responsibility," she said calmly. "They never determine the value of the person standing before us." Her words reflected the same philosophy she had carried throughout her career, one grounded in the belief that equal justice depended upon equal dignity. Michael Bennett continued coordinating the justice's protective detail with the quiet professionalism that had always defined his work. Looking back on the encounter outside the symposium, he often reminded newer members of the team that restraint was one of the greatest strengths any protective professional could demonstrate. "Our success," he explained during a briefing, "is measured by how many ordinary days remain ordinary." One evening, representatives from the judiciary, law enforcement, and several community organizations gathered for an annual civic leadership reception celebrating cooperation among public institutions. Justice Brooks, Officer Harper, and Michael Bennett all attended, each representing a different responsibility, yet sharing the same commitment to public trust. During the reception, Daniel thanked the justice once more for the grace she had shown on the morning they first met. She responded with the familiar warmth that had characterized every conversation between them since then. "The Constitution belongs to every citizen," she said quietly. "Those who serve it best never forget the humanity of the people standing in front of them." Daniel carried those words with him as the evening came to a close. Looking across the room at judges, officers, educators, students, and community leaders speaking openly with one another, he realized that lasting confidence in justice was not built by a single remarkable moment. It was built through countless ordinary choices made with fairness, wisdom, patience, and respect, one conversation at a time, until those choices quietly became the character of the institutions entrusted to serve everyone equally. Spring returned to Washington, District of Columbia, bringing fresh blossoms to the city's parks and renewed energy to the streets that connected its historic institutions. Nearly a year had passed since one quiet conversation outside a federal building had changed the direction of several lives, not through conflict or public spectacle, but through reflection, accountability, and the willingness to learn. Justice Evelyn Brooks continued carrying out her responsibilities with the same quiet discipline that had earned the respect of colleagues across the legal community. She never spoke publicly about the encounter that had unfolded months earlier, because she believed the strongest lessons were often demonstrated through actions rather than stories. Every opinion she helped write, every student she encouraged, and every public address she delivered reflected the same enduring principle that had guided her entire career. Justice began with recognizing the dignity of every individual before any title, position, or reputation entered the conversation. Officer Daniel Harper had also continued growing into the public servant he had once hoped to become. New officers joining the department often found themselves assigned to ride alongside him during their earliest weeks of patrol. Instead of beginning every lesson with regulations, Daniel began with a simple question. What is the first responsibility we owe every person we meet? The answers varied, but by the end of each shift, they always arrived at the same conclusion. Fairness came before assumptions. Respect came before authority. Listening came before judgment. Those principles gradually became part of his daily routine until they no longer required conscious effort. They had become habits. Michael Bennett and the protective detail remained as professional and discreet as ever, continuing their mission without seeking recognition. Their greatest successes were measured not by dramatic interventions, but by the countless ordinary days during which the justice completed her work without disruption. Looking back, Michael often reflected that the most important moment on that Washington sidewalk had not been the introduction of official credentials. It had been the decision by everyone involved to remain calm enough for understanding to replace misunderstanding. One afternoon, another constitutional symposium invited Justice Brooks to deliver the closing remarks before an audience of judges, attorneys, police leaders, educators, and students. As she approached the podium, she noticed Officer Harper seated quietly among the guests, attending as part of a professional development program. Their eyes met briefly, and they exchanged a respectful nod that required no further explanation. When Justice Brooks began speaking, her voice carried the calm confidence that had steadied every difficult conversation throughout her career. Every generation inherits institutions built by those who came before, she said. Our responsibility is not merely to preserve them. It is to strengthen them through wisdom, humility, and the courage to improve whenever improvement is needed. The audience responded with thoughtful silence before warm applause gradually filled the hall. After the event concluded, people from different professions remained behind, continuing conversations about public trust, constitutional principles, and the shared responsibility carried by everyone serving their communities. Daniel stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, watching citizens from every background walk peacefully through the nation's capital. He understood that each encounter offered another opportunity to earn trust rather than expect it. Across the plaza, Justice Brooks entered her waiting vehicle while Michael quietly confirmed the day's final schedule. The city continued moving exactly as it always had, yet something meaningful had changed within the people who had shared that ordinary morning months before. They had discovered that genuine authority was never proven by a badge, a title, or a position. It was revealed through character when no one expected it, strengthened through humility when mistakes occurred, and remembered through the quiet respect offered to every person without exception. Because in the end, the strongest guardians of justice are not those who hold the greatest power, but those who choose every single day to use that power with fairness, wisdom, and unwavering dignity.